Hey everyone, it's Mrs. Shannon. This is the introductory lesson previewing AP Biology and sort of the structure and what to expect from it. This is the introductory lesson and it will be found in Canvas in your modules, just like all the other ones are going to be found. If you go into modules under Introduction and Science Practices, Introduction Prezi Notes. Anytime you see Prezi Notes, that's stuff that you need to pay attention to. Here is what it will look like for any of them. Right now it's blank up here. When I'm finished with this screencast, I will post it in YouTube format at the top. If you want to watch the Prezi by itself without me talking or go back to it at any point and refer to it, it will be below it. And then the questions to answer in your notebook will be posted below that. Now, when you're doing this, know that I did not make these. There are two gurus in AP Biology that does help with curriculum. Actually, there's probably like 5 or 6 that I'll refer to. And these are people that actually go around and assist curriculum development for College Board and AP Bio, and a lot of people will refer back to them. Paul Anderson of Bozeman, Montana is one. A lot of people are familiar with him and from other classes too. And so use a lot of Bozeman videos. And David Nufke is another. So he has these Prezi set up that's really language friendly, user friendly, and we'll be using a lot of them. I modify usually the questions to fit our needs, but the Prezis are done pretty well. So for the most part, we'll be using them. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to start on the first one. So make sure you've looked at the PDQ so you know what to look for. And let's see if we can make it big screen. And we're off and away. Every Prezi will start with a couple of big questions. What are the big ideas? You, in the course of this AP course or any course, especially science related, I would say, are not going to be able to remember all the little details. Are not going to be able to remember all vocabulary. But if you can remember the big ideas and the big connections, you might be able to figure out enough about it to understand it at an appropriate level. So the big questions from this presentation that it's going to address is, how is science different from other ways of understanding the universe? And then what are the major questions that biologists in particular study? So biologists as compared to chemists or physicists. Okay, so when we begin, there's a little video. It's cheesy. I'm going to skip it for now. It's like 45 seconds. But know that science is a way to think, and it's a body of knowledge. Think about how I talked about science practices. That's how we're thinking. We're thinking in terms of designing experiments, communicating ideas, connecting ideas. And the body of knowledge falls under the content part of it. A couple of notes on the scientific method. We don't go back and review it. It's a process. It's cyclical in nature. It's non-ending. But usually, you see something, you think of a reason why, and you figure out a way to check your reason. And then now everyone gets the dump on you, and you have to be able to repeat it until some consensus is formed. We'll talk a little bit about over here when it talks about why these are different: space alien infiltration, environmental pollution. And a lot of it has to come down to, can we figure out a way to check it? Okay. And can we analyze the results and repeat them? And that's what really separates science from other ways of thinking when it comes to the scientific method. Okay, see something, think of a reason why. This is really loose. It's not numbered. It kind of is numbered steps, but you don't have to memorize them in order as long as you go through the process. Science isn't the only way of thinking. Philosophy, religion, art. We have some similarities. We look for patterns. We try to find out explanations. We try to alleviate those fears, things that we don't know we want to have answered. We try to make sense of what's around us. We see the beauty in what's around us, but they all have their differences too. So think about those differences and see what you can come up with. Now, there's 2 major modes of scientific thoughts, and if you take college level biology courses, whether it is introductory or advanced ones, there's sometimes a discrepancy in how it's approached. I won't say discrepancy because you're going to learn the same ideas, but a fundamental difference in how it's approached. And it's sort of goes to these two major modes of scientific thought. Okay, there's reductionism, where you start with something that's super complex, and then you break it down into simpler parts. And so each level of organization emerges from the interactions of the components of the level beneath it. Okay, so this right here is due to interactions from here, which is due to interactions from here, and so forth. So by the time you get to the leaf, interactions of the tissues, interactions of the cells, and so forth. Okay, so then you have to think, is a thing just the sum of its parts? Those of you that are very math-oriented sometimes gravitate towards this direction. I myself gravitate towards this direction as well. And in fact, the sequence that we are going, just so you know, is we are doing reduction. It's still for a form of reductionism. We're still looking at these emergent properties, but we're going to start with the small and work our way up. And we're going to see what happens as the small come together. Their properties will actually change. So when you have your molecules come together, the properties will be different, but it forms something that's different and functional. The other way of looking at it, and we'll still approach this and incorporate this a lot, is a systems thinking. So we're not looking at the specific parts, but we're looking at how it all works and fits in together. And so when we look at feedback loops, that's a great example of a systems level, where we're looking at what's beginning a process, ending a process, what's being changed around it, and we're looking at the different components, whether it's the environment, the inside of the system, etc. We'll go through feedback loops in which the output decreases the process. The more you get, or the more that happens, the less is going to be put out. It's sort of regulation, so you don't get too much of something in nature. And this is the most often type of feedback that we'll see, negative feedback, okay? So you produce enough of something, it starts to slow down, and it will stop being produced eventually. On the flip side, positive feedback. The positive feedback, more gets you more. It accelerates in nature, and it leads to something that's transformative. Positive feedback is not as seen as often as negative feedback. It's not used as often as negative feedback. A great example of it would be labor, childbirth. When a woman is ready to give birth and they go through contractions, and it keeps signaling each contraction signals a greater increase in the output of the hormones, and the contractions increase and increase until the birth of the baby. Okay, this is the transformative nature of it. To understand a system, models are necessary, and the complexity of models is inherently limited. There's always going to be something that a model cannot show, depending on the perspective. We have computer models, we have two-dimensional models, we have three-dimensional models, we have analogies. We can use models, but there's going to be a limitation. We can't predict everything from the system. Now, the 7 practices that I keep referring to are listed here. Again, they're listed in the back of the room too, and we're going to be going through this. Number 7 is what I'm going to keep referring back to. This is what's going to set the passers from those that don't pass. You need to be able to work with information across multiple domains. You need to connect evolution with animal behavior, and you need to connect that animal behavior with what's going on with the interactions of the information down at the cellular level. And you need to connect that to perhaps the signaling that's being given at the nervous system level. And so there's different levels, different domains that you're going to need to connect with. In addition, you're going to connect it to other science disciplines. The other one that we'll be using a lot is the scientific explanations, the claim, the evidence, and the reasoning, how we analyze data, and how we use our models. So 1, 5, 6, and 7 are going to be what we use the most often in here. So when we talk about domains and crossing these domains in the science practices, what do we mean? Well, here's the whole idea. These are unifying themes that connect sort of our topics. The domain one, and the one that's the most prevalent, is evolution. this is the fundamental theory that connects all these domains, everything together. And it's the idea that change does happen over time. It's the idea that change is going to continue to happen. It's the idea that this change occurs and is passed on through some sort of information molecule, such as DNA. And so we're always going to be looking at what is changing and what influences made this change particularly successful for this organism in this environment. And so we'll be coming back to different functions that the body has, for instance, and seeing why the body has that, trying to come up with ideas, questions, why it happens, and then looking for evidence to support that. The next couple of domains, sort of going with big ideas, Domain 2, matter, and Domain 3, energy, are part of big idea number 2. Life is ordered. It's got stuff in it. What is the stuff in life? And that's your matter, the energy that's needed for for biological organisms to do what they do, and the information to create these organisms, to have these organisms function in a way that they do. And then we have a few other domains. We have regulation of information. And that's like the feedback loops. Oops. We're not going to spend time on evolution right now. Let me go through here. Natural selection. Hopefully you remember some of this from regular biology. But we'll focus more on that second semester. Matter, we talked about cells. It's the fundamental unit of life. You can have one cellular or unicellular organisms, but you can't have anything smaller that's considered a living organism. We'll look at different types of energy and how these energies cycle, different forms of energy cycle through an environment and living organisms. We're going to look at how matter cycles through. And, I shouldn't use the term cycle for energy. It's more energy flows. How information is needed and how it's stored. The main information molecule is DNA. The DNA is what gives us the template for the RNA that then goes and produces the proteins, instructs the production of the proteins. So without the template, the DNA template, we wouldn't be able to put together the living life forms that we see around us. So we'll get into a little bit of that towards the end of this first semester. Regulation, that's the feedback loops. How do living systems develop? How are they monitored, coordinated? So we're going to look at the endocrine system. We're going to look at the different glands and how those feedback loops, how those systems interact. Okay, and here's an immune response. So we're going to look at the immune system as well. Communication. We're going to look at the cellular level of communication as signals are received, such as a hormone, and how they are received at the membrane, at the cellular membrane, and then what it activates once it is received. Okay, we're going to see how communication then also happens throughout the body, not just at the cellular level. How communication happens between members of the same species, and how communication happens between members of different species. And then again, we're going to look at interactions. Okay, so ladybugs, and I think it was bugs eating bugs. I think, or maybe it was bugs reproducing. I'm not sure, but we are going to look at interactions within and between individuals. Inter and intra. Hopefully, you guys remember those prefixes. Inter is between organisms or between individuals. Intra is within that certain individual. We can look at interactions within and between ecosystems. So we're looking at different levels within, oops, I'm surprised that didn't go. Nope, it didn't go. Between ecosystems, we're going to look at interactions between living and non-living things, and that's part of the ecosystem level. So there's different levels of interactions that we're going to be looking at as well. But everything that we talk about, we're going to try to find what domains can we connect it to, because when we start bridging those connections, making those connections, we're making the higher level connections. We're able to see more clearly the biological principles and I guess the consequences of some of the actions that have happened and how they will affect those that will happen and continue to happen. And you start looking at pharmaceuticals, and you start looking at drug interactions, and you start looking in the medical world and hospital therapies, and you start looking into veterinary medicine, and you start to really understand the why of how things are done instead of just the procedures behind them. So make sure that you can explain how science works as a process. And so you're going to look at the different practices that we have, the verbs of how it's done, how being a scientist is. You're going to contrast science with other ways of looking at the universe. So we talked a little bit about similarities, and I mentioned to think of the differences. Compare the approach taken by reductionist and systems level modes. Now, these really, you won't be given a question specifically on this, but if you can start looking at things as, okay, how does this work? Why does this work? And why is this different than the parts that made it? You'll start to understand it a little bit more and explain why biology is a science. Finally, you should be able to give a brief explanation of how life is organized across several domains, so what those domains are. Okay, so hopefully this helps. Between this and your reading, it should give you a better understanding of the scope of the class. And if you have any questions, just feel free to ask.